Peace and greetings. My name is Reverend Waltrina Middleton. I serve as the Executive Director with Community Renewal Society in Chicago, Illinois. Really honored to be here today with one of our board members and friends of the CRS community, Kevin Tyson. And Kevin has a longstanding history in Chicago and across this country as an advocate for justice and human rights. Welcome, Kevin, and I invite you to share a little bit of background about yourself and the work that you do and the organizations you're involved and engaged with. And welcome to this conversation and this dialogue addressing the movement for liberation with Palestine.
Well, thank you, Dr. Middleton, and I really appreciate this invitation. So I'm Kevin Tyson. My history in the movement dates back to the early 70s. I was a member of the Youth Committee to Free Angela Davis, and basically grew up with a number of the members of the Black Panther Party in New York, including Assata Shakur, Dhoruba Moore, and others. So I basically got baptized in the Black nationalist movement that evolved into an international movement, if you will. And then have worked with a number of organizations. My organizing work has been with, basically began with tenant organizing, and has evolved into work within the United Church of Christ. I'm a member of Trinity, United Church of Christ. And between New York and Chicago, you just have seen similar movements bridging different people in Africa and the diaspora, and particular interest in the links between the movement for freedom in Palestine and the movement that we've had here in the United States and the movement in South Africa. I'm also a member of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which grew out of the Angela Davis movement. And here in Chicago, the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression, which currently has several campaigns going on, including one for the civilian control of the police department in Chicago, which is known as, I'm sorry, excuse me, which was formerly known as the CPAC campaign, and has since merged with other organizations for the empowering communities for
Public safety.
Oh, empowering communities for ECPS. I'm done. You know the
Yes.
acronym.
Yes.
And that was really a work that became historic in the sense of bringing so many organizations together around an issue that impacts the Black community in particular, but in general, impacts all communities. There's links in these movements. The link for police accountability actually has historic significance in how communities are put under siege. And that is a particular issue for Palestine, the way that Palestine has been under siege by the political state of Israel. And it's important to understand the difference between what we know from scripture as Israel and what currently exists. In particular—
and let me just jump in. Because I just for a point of reference, that the Empowering Communities for Public Safety was a merger of not only CPAC, but also GAPA, which is the Grassroots Alliance for Police Accountability, which is endorsed by Community Renewal Society. So it was two entities in our community that found common ground and putting forward our shared interest, which is to ensure that the public is safe and free from police brutality and holding those systems accountable. So I want folks to know I would be remiss as the executive director if I did not indicate that GAPA is also a founding partner for this alliance.
Yes, yes, most definitely. So the current situation in Palestine should be of interest to African Americans and really all people in this country because of the support that the US gives to the political state of Israel and the oppression of the Palestinian people. And we need to acknowledge the fact that Jesus was a Palestinian. And while that may be used simply as a point of reference, it does have particular importance to the current position that Palestinians have been put in. As an example, the movement of the that was done under the Trump administration of excuse me, Dr. Middleton, I'm sorry, my throat's dry. Okay. Yeah, of the from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and the refusal of elected officials in the United States to really stand up to what can be called anything other than apartheid. That apartheid that's happening in Palestine. But there's definitely links in these movements, and our solidarity movement has to understand, as Dr. King said, that if there is injustice going on anywhere, it's an injustice everywhere, and that we were all impacted by it.
Ashe. And in listening and reading some of the writings of Angela Davis, I'm inspired. For a long time, she's indicated that we cannot even begin to talk about Black liberation until Palestinians are free. And furthermore, you know, when we talk about the three evils of society, Angela Davis adds the fourth. You know, she talks about militarism and poverty and racism, but she also adds sexism, you know, and so when we look at the evils that were lifted up when we address the oppression of Blacks in the civil rights era here in the US, those evils can still be applied when we're looking at the oppression and the marginalization of Palestinian communities today, and has been since the creation of the Israeli state that is occupying Palestine. And so I feel that I agree with you, and I appreciate your lifting up the work of Angela Davis and the alignment and the wisdom she brings to the movement for Black lives and how it must be expanded or inclusive of the global diaspora.
Well, you know, Angela is one of, it's certainly an important and critical voice in this movement. But let's remember that several leaders, Black leaders, raised this issue years ago. The Black Panther Party called for solidarity with Palestine. Malcolm X called for solidarity with Palestine. Dr. King is sometimes misquoted And if I remember, there's still no evidence that he ever made the comment that anti-Zionism is equated with anti-Semitism. Because understanding the issue that it is oppression, it is very, there are parallels. Although, we don't want to put the issue of oppression under one umbrella. There are particulars, but we do see common denominators. And definitely in this particular situation, we have to think about the links that the state of Israel had with South Africa during the apartheid years, and US complicity, funding the whole mineral issue. There's a number of things that link oppressors. And so it's important for us to understand the fact that while we are not responsible for our oppression, we are responsible for our liberation. And that's global. We have to be in a position to work as Black people in America. We need to be able to work with others when we see a common enemy that can impact all of us as a global community, and particularly in the faith community. We have to understand that our community is one that strives for peace, that strives for love. The concept of the beloved community. Part of that has to be that understanding the fact that peace does not come through war. Peace comes through negotiation, but also peace has to acknowledge and respect the rights of others to be able to live in peace. So you can't have a conflict going on in a country where there are someone who or a group is quote unquote comfortable while another group is being bombed, massacres, especially with the children in Palestine, the gentrification / occupation, hunger issues, a number of things that are going on. And we see that happening here too. We saw that happening in South Africa. We see common threads of oppression. And that is what should call us to a unified front against that type of oppression.
Let's talk a little bit about the socioeconomic implications as well. One longstanding campaign is the BDS, Boycott, Divest, and Sanction. And I think that I haven't heard it lifted up in recent years, but that still is an ongoing campaign in calling upon communities to be in solidarity with the Palestinian community by boycotting, divesting from, and placing sanctions upon the state of Israel, or the occupying state of Israel. And also, when you think of that socioeconomic lens, I'm also thinking about the billions of dollars that the U.S. government, which you alluded to, invest in the Israel military force, and compared to millions, which is substantially smaller amounts of money that goes into supporting Palestinian aid, which was actually stopped completely during the former presidential administration of the U.S. Prior to the current one, Biden's. But also, when I look at the ways that the prison industrial complex is funded, even with the Department of Justice investigation into the abuses that we see in the prison systems across the U.S., millions of dollars are still poured into funding those police departments. The Chicago Police Department itself has received millions of dollars of funds from the federal government, even after the Department of Justice investigated and found substantial evidence of abuse and discrimination and outright racism or biases based on race, the geographic location, and also the socioeconomic status of some communities. And so when you look at funding of the prison industrial complex, of militarized policing, and the ways that this government, the US government, continues, it doesn't matter if it's Democrat, Republican, or what, those administrations continue to pour billions of dollars as Chicago schools are closed down, as there are still continue to be people without the resources that they need. How can we continue to look at BDS as a tool, and what else may you add regarding the socioeconomic impact of this movement?
Well, I think you know, you hit it on the head. You know, the BDS movement, you know, which there are mainline Protestant denominations that play an integral role in that divestment movement. Certainly, United Church of Christ, but the Presbyterian and the Methodist denominations. I think it was the Methodist. The Methodists actually put, you know, at one point had investments for their pension, invested in companies that were doing business in excuse me, in Tel Aviv, and pulled those funds out. You know, understanding that that is one of the strongest movements to put pressure on governments. Certainly, that was the case, you know, in Southern Africa. But you mentioned the Chicago Police Department. Well, it's interesting that there's links between the Chicago Police Department and the Israeli intelligence and the South African police. In terms of cross-training, some strategies, tactics. One thing that's interesting to note is the concept of having a central area for that's used by military and police to control an area was very common in South Africa, is still common in the United States when you look at the way housing projects were built with a central, you know, however you want to call it. But it was an area where if there was any type of action to take place, everybody would have to run to a central area to get out of the building. That is what happened in South Africa. That is what's happening here. That is what's happening in Palestine. There are no back doors if there's any type of military move that's done. And you know, let's not get into the weeds, but you mentioned the the amount of money that is put into militarism that's not only in quote unquote war situations, but also in oppression in communities. And give me 1 second.
I'm so sorry.
Mhm.
Oh, it's okay.
But it's important to note that the millions of dollars that go in aid from this country into Israel, and the cutoff of funds that were going for quote unquote Palestinian aid, although it is been by both Republicans and Democrats, how US citizens' opinions and discussions never seem to hit on that point with the intensity that it should, that the US is funding murder.
Right.
And we sometimes overlook that in, you know, in the sense of and using the excuse that, well, we're quote unquote funding both sides. Well, that's, as you mentioned, that's really not what's going on. The money that goes to Palestine is going for quote unquote material aid. The money that goes to Israel is military aid. And there is a difference.
In this movement for Black and Brown lives and Indigenous lives here in this country, what are the intersections that we observe and see as we're also witnessing Palestinians fight for their liberation? And what are ways that we can embrace those intersectionalities to be in solidarity with this movement?
Well, I think the issue of occupation of land is a big one. And the interesting thing to note with that is, you know, there were a number of Black-led organizations that actually supported Israel's quote unquote right to exist back in the 70s and 80s, because they saw a parallel between that and the calls for a separate state for Blacks in the United States, the Liberia movement, those types of things, saying that the solution is separatism. Well, right now you see a situation with segregation in Palestine. We still see segregation here. There's very common threads that Black and Latinx people can identify with that are happening in Palestine, and very similar to what was happening in South Africa, and some say still happens in South Africa, but that's another story. Um, but as you mentioned, it's it's important for us to understand that uh, our fights, while there are particulars, they're very common in that we're fighting simply for the right to exist. There's genocide that is going on in Palestine, and many say there's genocide that is going on in the United States against Black and Latinx people, whether it is police brutality, whether it is benign neglect, whether it is, uh, excuse me, lack of resources, from healthcare to housing, to maternal health. There's a number of things that we see happening here that are happening as a result of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. We can build a solidarity movement similar to what the ANC in South Africa and the PLO in Palestine tried to do in raising this issue of the denial of human rights that are happening here. This is what people like William Patterson and Paul Robeson raised, the issue of genocide being committed against Black people in the United States and what is happening in Palestine. Um, the unfortunate thing is our elected officials, because of their links to businesses and business persons who support Israel, the funding that's given to campaigns, they remain silent on this issue. So we can't rely on them. We have to do it. We have to raise the voices. We have to be the force to bring solidarity between people who are oppressed. And in particular, in this case, we see the genocide that's going on in Palestine. We have to march with our sisters and brothers who are fighting for their lives, fighting for their families in Palestine, um, just as we would want them to support our our Black Lives Matter, and in fact, Black Lives Matter and the movement for Black Lives have been some of the more vocal supporters of the Palestinian rights.
And Palestinians have been supportive of the movement for Black Lives.
Yes.
I mean, I've shared in conversations with others that, you know, in Ferguson, when the world witnessed the tear gassing and the abusive use of force by militarized force by police in Ferguson, Palestinians were using social media platforms to talk to Ferguson activists on how to create gas masks or how to protect yourself from the burns and things of that nature. So they have been in solidarity, and to your point, longstanding solidarity throughout the various movements. And just for those who may not know, you use the acronym PLO, and that's the Palestinian Liberation Organization, in case they wanted to look that up and learn more about PLO and the work that it's doing for that movement. How do we always ask that question, where do we go from here? And so in this moment, in this Kairos moment where the world is paying close attention, and one may even say George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, you know, and the uprisings that we saw in the US in this past year has contributed to the awareness, the consciousness in this moment, along with the deep-rooted history of organizing and resistance in Palestine, of course. But what are we called to do in this moment? Who are we called to be in this movement as a beloved community? And we ask the question, where do we go from here? How do we look at our moral responsibility and accountability in this Kairos moment right now?
Well, I think, you know, you touched on so many points that would lead us to build a united front. We have to understand that as Black, as Latinx, we have a vested interest in watching and participating in the dismantling of colonialism, of imperialism, some will say of capitalism. But the bottom line is we fight for unity. So we have situations now where there may be an inroad to really pressure elected officials here to raise the issue again of, as you mentioned, the funding. And it means knocking on some doors. It means being able to go to some offices and basically letting the as I talked about, those that are comfortable, making the comfortable people uncomfortable, in knowing that we do see a link in our fights. We do see common interest in our liberation. So it's really all hands on deck. I would say anybody that supports Black Lives Matter should, I'm not talking about the organization, I'm talking about the concept, should understand that that is the same type of passion that we need to bring to the fight for Palestinian rights. Because when you look at the concepts behind Black Lives Matter, they are the same. Yet there are particulars. but there is a common enemy in this. There's a common enemy of hate. There's a common enemy of misunderstanding. There's a common enemy of mistrust that we can help break down because we understand those fights. We've been through them. This is not something that is new for us in this country. And as we fight against oppression, it always has been our tactic to be able to target businesses like we did in South in the during the apartheid regime, to target businesses, to target individuals who are funding things that are not in our interest, funding projects that are not in our business, those who speak in favor of the occupation of Palestine, for us to target them, for us to boycott, call them out. But it has to be an organized movement,
Right,
organized in the sense that we understand we have common pillars, and we organize around those pillars.
right,
So, you know, where do we go? I think we need to maybe pull up some history so people are aware that this is not a new movement, that this movement has roots that go back. We need to pull up what Angela has said. We need to pull up what Huey Newton and the Panthers said.
James Baldwin.
James Baldwin, Cornel West. I mean, there a number of leaders in the Black liberation movement have called for solidarity with the Palestinians, and we need to pull some of that out of the libraries and out of our desks and our drawers and put it back on the table.
Yeah, Alice Walker. You know, Alice Walker has been very vocal
Yes. Yes.
for a long time as well. And I think you're right. I mean, I love what you're saying. Almost a resurgence of the Rainbow Coalition, where we understand the importance of our collective work and responsibility.
Yes. Yes.
So
Yes.
very grateful for your wisdom and for your deep passion for human rights and liberation for all. And I'm very grateful for your service and leadership as a member of the board for Community Renewal Society. And to your point, we have actually compiled a listing of resources regarding the Palestinian struggle and the history of the occupation of Palestine. And that can be found on our website, www.communityrenewalsociety.org. And we invite those that are viewing this to visit our website, to engage those resources and our coalition partners that are sharing in this struggle. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes for all. And so thank you for being steadfast in this struggle. Peace and blessings.
Thank you. And certainly thank Community Renewal Society for the phenomenal work that it does in trying to bridge communities together.
Ashe.
God bless.
God bless.